it's not an SUV, and nor is it fully electric. But what this, the updated Lexus ES 300 is a proper car. And when I say proper, what I mean is it's this kind of height. It's not tall, it's not boxy, it's not huge. It's actually quite low slung, even by four-door saloon car standards. And a four-door saloon car standard, for any of you who are wondering or confused by such a thing, is essentially this: a car with four doors and a boot and a roof. And no, it's not jacked up, it's not a 4x4, won't go off-road, don't even try it, who cares? This is a proper car. Now, in saying that it's not electric, of course, that's not quite accurate, because it is partially electric. It is hybrid. It carries over the same 2.5 litre four-cylinder engine and hybrid system from the previous ES, also shared with the likes of the Toyota Camry and the Toyota RAV4, and indeed the Lexus NX crossover. 218 horsepower, it's actually rather nice. But what's new about this car is the styling. Now, it's very, very subtly new. If we were to put a photograph of the old ES next to the video of this one, you wouldn't see a huge amount of difference. But allow me to point out where the differences are. Mostly it's here in the headlights. The swoosh of LED lighting signature is in a different position. The headlights are slightly different, slightly slimmer than before. And around here on the grille, there are fewer vertical bits in the grille, more angular L-shaped bits. If you look really closely, you can see that all of the bits of the grille are little Lexus L's. So that creates a kind of slightly cleaner, kind of slightly nicer, I think, look to the front end. It's, generally speaking, a very handsome car. Some people just don't get on with this big Dracula fang grille thing that Lexus does, but I quite like it, and I think quite a few people actually do. It's generally very good. There are bigger differences, and potentially more important differences, though, when we get on the inside. So the big change on the interior is up here, where we've got this new 12.3-inch touchscreen for the infotainment system. Now, as is commonly the case with Toyota and Lexus infotainment systems, it's still a little bit behind the curve of the best systems. It's not quite up there with what you get from, say, a Jaguar. It's not quite up there with what you get from a BMW or a Mercedes or an Audi, but it is much improved. And the big improvement is that it's much further forward. It's actually 100 millimeters closer to you than the previous version was. And now it's a proper touchscreen. It is actually one that works when you press it. You don't have to go down here and use this rather fiddly trackpad, although you can if you want to. And there's a couple of shortcut buttons here as well for setting things up and for fiddling with the various settings. It is a much, much improved system compared to what the previous ES 300H had, and it does still have this rather nice and handsome analog clock, which I do rather like. The other big improvement as far as the touchscreen goes is that now the ES 300H is compatible with the likes of Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which means that when you plug in your phone, you get all your apps and menu systems up here on the screen. It means you can actually bypass the still slightly clunky Lexus software, and it's a much more satisfying experience. It comes up here, nice and big and bright, much easier to use, much more pleasant. There's a few other small changes. There's a new set of partly digital, partly analog, and generally speaking, very handsome instruments here in the main binnacle. As before, you can switch between sport, normal, and eco modes with this big switch up here. The matching one on the other side switches the traction control on and off. You do have electric adjustment for all the major bits and pieces, such as the seats, which go up and down, and more importantly, the steering wheel, which goes in and out and down and up electrically. As you would expect from a Lexus, the quality levels are just off the scale good. I mean, the build of this car is just exceptionally good. Everything you touch looks and feels superbly expensive and superbly well engineered. It's a bit like sitting inside an expensive Seiko watch. It is redolent of the very best of Japanese quality and assembly that you can imagine. It's also very, very comfortable. These seats are terrific, and quite frankly, I prefer sitting low down. I don't like sitting up high in an SUV. I find this, looking out there, much more comfortable and actually much more reassuring and frankly a bit safer, if I'm honest, when I'm driving a car like this. It just feels more natural. Maybe that's just because I'm old. I am quite old. But it is a wonderful place in which to while away a long journey, and it's very good at doing those long journeys too. So if you were considering getting out of an SUV and getting into one of these ES300Hs, one of the things you might be worried about is practicality, but thankfully you don't really have to be. Okay, so it'll never be quite as versatile as an SUV because it doesn't have a hatch at the back, it's got a separate boot. But here in the back seat, you will find just as much room and comfort and refinement as you would in any high-end crossover. In fact, I'm effectively, as the phrase goes, sitting behind myself. That seat is set for me. I'm just over 6 foot tall, and as you can see, I've got plenty of leg room, plenty of space for my knees, loads of space for my feet. The only thing that's a little bit on the tight side is headroom. I'm just not quite brushing the roof with my head, and it's the same story in the front seat, in fact. The roof here is lower than you'll find in direct saloon rivals such as the BMW 5 Series, the Audi A6 and the Mercedes-Benz E-Class. So it is something worth considering if you regularly carry very tall passengers or maybe members of your local basketball squad in the back seat. However, they will be able to get very comfortable because there's a nice big armrest, little integrated cup holders. They'll be able to charge their devices because there's USB-C plugs and a 12-volt socket down here. And there's a little lockable ski flap as well for loading long items through from the boot. So all in all, the rear seats of the ES300H are actually pretty well appointed. It is a very pleasant place, just as much as the front seats are, in which to spend a long journey. As I say, you are going to sacrifice a bit of versatility relative to an SUV because this doesn't have a hatch. It's not an estate, it is a saloon, so you get a separate boot. Now, a little bit tricky to open because the button is all the way over here on the right, not here in the middle as you think it might be. Once you do get it open, it is a reasonable size, 454 litres. Now that is a bit smaller than you get in, say, a BMW 5 Series, an Audi A6 or a Mercedes-Benz E-Class. However, it is important to remember that the ES is only available as a hybrid. If you want to buy a hybrid 5 Series, a hybrid A6, a hybrid E-Class, they only come as plug-in hybrids, and the big batteries in those cars take up an awful lot more space in their boots. So overall, that means the ES300H hybrid for hybrid is actually slightly more practical than those rival cars. It is a decent sized boot, actually. In fairness, you can pack a fair amount of stuff in that, and it's a hell of a lot bigger than the boot on the old GS300 ever used to be, which is important to remember. One small thing, like an awful lot of Lexus and Toyota products, when you go to shut the boot, it does clang a bit annoyingly. It's the only part of the car that feels and sounds a bit cheap. So what is the ES300H like to drive? Well, the answer is really quite lovely. And I emphasize the word lovely because it's defiantly not sporty. It is not a car that tries to turn you into a junior Lewis Hamilton with the way it responds in corners and with the way it accelerates. Now, that's not to say it's not good to drive, absolutely not. It is in fact really very impressive, but it doesn't go down the BMW route of trying to be all precision and all involvement. It just isn't that kind of car. It's much more about comfort and refinement. And it does both of those things exceptionally well. As you can probably hear in the background, there's very little interior noise. Tyre noise and roar is very well suppressed. The 2.5 litre petrol engine does get a bit shouty when you extend the throttle and when you give it a long burst of acceleration, as it tends to in all Toyota and Lexus products that use a CVT gearbox, but it is much better suppressed than it used to be in previous models. So it's not going to intrude upon your comfort or upon your eardrums all that much. It's really, again, a very refined car, very comfortable. Now, the ride quality is not quite as smooth as it should be, I feel. You might be able to spot as we drive along, this isn't the best surfaced road in the world, you might be able to spot the camera moving as we skip slightly over bumps. It's not bad, it's not intrusive, it's not harsh in any sense, but neither does it quite glide with the same sort of liquid motion that you would expect of a Lexus, of a car that does major so much on refinement. Again, it's fine. It's not bad, and these are the smallest 18-inch alloy wheels that you can get on the ES300. So it's not the wheels and low-profile tyres that are doing this to the car. I think probably it's because the suspension has to be slightly stiff to cope with the weight of the hybrid system and the battery. It's not a terrible thing. It's not a deal breaker. I would like to see it improve, though. Steering is very light, but quite accurate. It's well geared, it's well weighted. The whole car responds really quite well in corners. Again, it's not a car you're going to drive for outright fun, but it does respond well. It does feel nice, and it certainly feels very secure and very stable and very sure-footed. Now, when you twist it up to sport mode, that means the engine kicks in with a bit more vehemence, a little bit earlier in the rev range. It isn't trying to hold back the engine and keep the electric part of the powertrain going in order to save fuel and save on emissions. So when you give it the shoe in sports mode, it really does feel very pleasantly brisk. It's never what I would call fast, certainly isn't slow. Economy is very good. Let me put it back into eco mode, which is really the mode you probably want to be driving it in more of the time, because it is a very economical car. Overall, we've been scoring about 6.0, 6.1 litres per 100 kilometres. That's in a combination of city, country and motorway driving over the course of several days. It does do better than that. On long, steady motorway journeys, it will breach the 5.5 litres per 100 kilometres line, which is pretty impressive for a big car that's running a petrol engine. It's easily now into competing with the diesel versions of, say, the 5 Series, the A6 and the E-Class when it comes to overall economy. In fact, it's probably better than them in some respects. It's not quite as economical as around town as you might expect of a hybrid. The economy does unfortunately go down a bit when you do drive in town a lot, but overall it's pretty impressive in that respect, and it has genuinely low CO2 emissions as well. Now, okay, you might be arguing that we should be looking at no CO2 emissions and no fuel consumption at all, because that's the way the car market is steadily moving. And yes, that's a very good point, but it's also the case that electric motoring doesn't quite suit all needs just yet. The charging network isn't quite there, the range isn't always there in the cars that you might want. So this is actually a pretty good compromise for a lot of people, particularly when you remember that according to Lexus's and Toyota's claims, backed up, it must be said, by research by UCD, hybrid cars like this can spend as much as 60 to 80% of a given journey running in electric mode. So that is a pretty solid contribution towards getting your CO2 emissions down. And I think that's something that's certainly worth considering for a lot of us. Overall, this is a car that excels on long journeys. The exceptional seat comfort, the really impressive refinement, the good stereo, all these things add up. It's the kind of car you point towards a distant horizon and just keep going until you get where you want to go. It does that with no little aplomb. It is really, really impressive as a long-haul companion. Not quite so great around town. It's not quite as maneuverable as you might expect, and it's a little bit difficult to judge where the corners are at some points. There is a reversing camera, which is a good one, and there are front and rear parking sensors, which help, but again, in very tight confines, it does feel every inch its size. There is also one other small issue to look at, which is that, of course, it does share its engine and a lot of its structure with the cheaper Toyota Camry. Now, the Camry is nowhere near as impressive inside as the ES300H, and it's not quite as nice to drive, but overall, Camry is a very impressive vehicle, and it is worth considering as a rival to the ES300H, one that has the same hybrid system, the same CO2 figures, the same fuel economy, the same performance, if not quite the same refinement, comfort, and certainly not the same badge appeal. Okay, so it's not an SUV and it's not fully electric. So you could argue that the Lexus ES300H is kind of swerving away from the zeitgeist to an extent, but to be honest, I quite like that. I'm a lover of traditional cars, of four-door saloons with a boot, stuff that isn't yet another SUV and crossover. And for that reason, I really do like this car. So it's not about being fashionable, it's about satisfaction. It's about satisfaction in the comfort, satisfaction in the refinement, satisfaction in the economy, satisfaction above all in the quality. Because to be honest, BMW doesn't have quality as good as this car. Mercedes doesn't have quality as good as this car. Audi probably comes close, but it's not quite there. Tesla, forget it, nowhere near. This is a car that will last and last, and it will be satisfying for every single one of those days that you own it.